Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Karen Hardy, and welcome to Flip This Risk podcast, where we interview high achievers about the relationship of risk taking and how that influences their leadership resiliency. Of course, you can check out the podcast at flipthisriskpodcast.com. And today I'm very excited to have with us Iniobong Enang, who is a senior lecturer and assistant professor of risk management at Coventry University in the UK.
Yes.
Hello, and welcome, Ini.
Hello, Dr. Karen. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, absolutely. You're doing great work in this area. I wanted to get you on for the new year to talk about uh, risk management in a different domain that people may not know has a significant impact in that area,
Mhm.
which is public service reform. For those who don't know, Eni has a recent book titled Risk Management and Public Service Reform, with new understanding about social risk management within the broad context of public service reform and using school education reform and two Scottish local authorities as case studies. So that's all sounds very fascinating. The first thing I picked up, Eni, was the fact that your book aims to promote a new understanding, the key word being new, about social risk management. So let's just start with the basic question so everyone can be a part of this conversation. What is social risk generally? And then we're going to go into why it's important to generate an understanding around that.
Okay. Thank you for that question, Karen. So, yeah, social risks are factors that can exacerbate inequality of outcomes, exclusions, poverty, and or they can reduce the quality of life. So, it is very important to generate understanding around this concept so that we can address the negative, the potential negative consequences associated with social risks. So when I talk about addressing them, we can either prevent them, we can, transfer them, we can manage them. So there are different ways that we can treat this risk. So it's important that we understand what they are first, and then we can know how to address them.
So what are the social risks in general? Are there types of social risk? Are they all alike?
So the social risks, and I'm going to talk, consider the context of social school education provision and
Okay.
so my book and my research, so my PhD research and consequently the monograph that captures the findings from that research, looked at social risk, the production and management of social risks within the broad context of public service reform, like you mentioned, but then focusing on two Scottish anonymous local authorities. And because the local authorities are responsible for the provision and reform of basically provision of school education in Scotland.
Hmm.
And so, oh, sorry, were you about to say something?
No, no, go ahead.
Okay, and so the social risk, so looking at the context of guys is remember that there are factors that can exacerbate inequality of outcomes. And so the social risks associated with the school education reforms in both anonymous local councils, I'll call them councils A and B, they appeared mainly in the form of attainment inequality risk. So this risk, this attainment inequality risk. So when I talk about attainment inequality risk, I'm talking about factors that can worsen attainment of educational school education outcomes in school children. So we're talking about, and this attainment inequality can be further broken down as in they can manifest as inequalities of outcomes.
Got
That's
it.
learning outcomes. They can manifest as exclusions. And so basically inequalities of learning outcomes, exclusions, and poor learning outcomes. And I'll give you an example. So let's look at young people from middle income families. These children or these young people, so children and young people, they may be excluded from reform initiatives, because, for example, in Scotland, what was happening is there's this Scottish Attainment Challenge. It's an initiative, it's a reform initiative instigated by the Scottish government, and it targets young children, young people from deprived communities. And it's identified, these children are identified based on an index. based on, it's like a postcode, using the postcode, so Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation. So what happens is that some children will be identified as living in deprived communities, and others as living in middle-income communities, families, or from middle-income families, and others from, very well comfortable income,
Mm-hmm.
high achieving families, kind of. And so what happens is that funds are allocated to children from that are struggling, deprived communities. So we have targeted funds from this initiative, Scottish Attainment Challenge, targeted at those children who struggle. Now, those at the top, those who are less deprived, from less deprived families, don't need that money. And so they're not allocated that, which is fine because they can afford it. Their parents can afford it, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
But guess who suffers? Those in the middle. So young children from middle income families might struggle because they are inadvertently excluded. It's not on purpose. Well, I can't actually say it's not on purpose, but they are excluded from this kind of transformative initiatives that can help them to further perform better in school. And if you look at what happens, and this is not just within the school education context, it happens in public, basically across board.
Mm-hmm.
Now, people from middle income families, they are the ones who bear the shock. Any sudden increase in maybe the amount of money we pay for tax, or increased rates or shocks in the system, affects them. There's some that are middle income families, but they're middle income families, and they can easily move over. They're sitting on the edge, and any little shock to the economy can affect them and push them into the poverty bracket. Do you understand?
Yeah.
So these young people do not have the relevant financial support. And if there is any change, perhaps a family member falls ill, or maybe a family member loses their job and they have to struggle for a bit, then these children will be excluded from any funding support that will help them to improve in their studies.
Got it. So
So
that's really unfair, isn't it? Because obviously it sounds like the middle class is the forgotten class when it comes to initiatives. So because you either look at those with the lower income, or the different, living conditions, or
yeah,
the upper class, but then the middle class is forgotten, and can't take advantage of these initiatives that you're speaking of. And that's a
yeah,
big risk. Is that the big risk that you found?
that is the big risk because they're excluded. So at the end of the day, what we really want is to make sure that everybody is on a level playing field, isn't it? So that they can achieve in the same way. We don't want a situation in which some children are advantaged. Some children have better opportunities. I mean, it will
Mm-hmm.
always happen, but we want to try as much as possible to make sure that everyone is playing on a level field. And this kind of targeted funding can inadvertently affect children from middle income families, for example. And it's not, and if you look at it in other works in other initiatives, public service support, you will find that the people who struggle, who are usually forgotten, are those in that middle income bracket.
That's interesting, because you wouldn't automatically think that. You would just
Yeah.
make an assumption that that's fine, and it's the
Mhm.
other two classes that you will focus on. So what are the implications for that oversight of, absent your research, what type of understanding was that? Because you mentioned that the whole point of the book is to promote new understanding of social risk management. What was the old understanding versus the new understanding of that?
So there was really not much understanding of social risk. I mean,
Oh.
it's there, it's being discussed implicitly. It's not explicit. So
Mhm.
if you look at risk registers, they would talk about financial risk, project risk, construction risk, legal risk, regulatory risk, but you
Mhm.
would hardly see any reference to social risk.
That's interesting.
So
Within the risk taxonomy, those aren't the usual suspects, right? Those are usually
yes,
just, yeah, usually, so those typical categories of risk within organizations. So you've seen that that was one of the elements missing from the taxonomy when it comes to risk management in the category. So both of us know, if it's not there, if it's not identified as a category,
Exactly.
It won't be discussed, decisions won't be made about it, and it's pretty much out of sight.
Yeah, it is. And so I found out that a few, so what happened was that in in the two local authorities, one of them, Council B, had more, it seemed like they had a more mature understanding because the head of education at that time was very risk aware. She had a PhD and she was really interested in studying further about issues relating to risk. So when I had this interview with them, they were able to understand, grasp the concept of social risk, but it was not explicitly in any documentation. But they had a more mature understanding compared to Council A. But in Council A, however, and in Council B as well, the chief executive was also had worked formerly as an auditor,
Mm-hmm.
at some point, so was exposed to a lot of risk management discussion, discourse, potential training and all of that. So when I interviewed the other staff, not just those at the top management level,
Mm-hmm.
mid level management, they were also using the kind of taxonomy and diction that their senior colleagues were using. And so there was a difference in the way social risk was conceptualized, understood, grasped in both local councils. And I imagine that it would be the case in not just Scotland, the UK, it would be the case anywhere because senior management set the tone
Mm-hmm.
for risk management and enterprise risk management. So we've moved into enterprise risk management because really, when you talk about social risk, we're talking about making sure that it's embedded within the fabric of the organization, is understood as well, and then it trickles down right from the top to the frontline managers.
Oh,
So
definitely.
that's what, yes. And
So yeah,
oh, sorry,
definitely.
go
I'm
on.
going to jump in real quick because this is fascinating. Now, assuming you talk to a lot of the social service organizations in public service, that's the assumption I'm making. And we talked about the social piece and how that's not part of that taxonomy. What about ESG? Now, ESG has environmental social governance. Are executives assuming that ESG covers what you're trying to bring to their attention? Does ESG cover that, or can ESG um, be one of the categories for including social uh, risk?
Yes, it can be one of the categories, but we need to make clear that the focus extends beyond the environment and
Hmm.
includes the quality of life of people. And so what happens, you did ask about the unintended consequences of social risk. So what happens is the unintended consequence of social risk would be the failure of maybe student inequality. So that then transfers or translates to what happens when they graduate from secondary school, when they're done from secondary school, because if they don't have good grades, it would then impact on the kind of jobs they have or whether they even get jobs. It's very competitive out there. And so if we look at ESG, it's talking about the environmental and social part of it,
Hmm.
but we
Hmm.
need to be explicit about the quality of life. We need to be explicit about things like inequality, which social risk seeks to address. Social risk management seeks to address. We need to be explicit about issues relating to poverty and exclusion. So ESG, and that's a very good point that you raised, Karen. ESG can be expanded to include social risk.
Hmm. So, from your findings, what recommendations did you make to public service organizations moving forward? What are they expected to do now that you discovered that this is an area of vulnerability that needs to be taken into consideration?
Yes, so based on my primary research findings, there was this what I found out was that social risk cannot be managed in silos. So
Hmm.
the recommendation basically was that multidisciplinary teams with relevant expertise are required to address social risk issues in a holistic manner. So it cannot be just the chief executive or the risk manager. It has to be a multidisciplinary there has to be a multidisciplinary platform or a multidisciplinary team, but then they also have to be well trained on what social risk means and how to manage social risk. And this has to be done in a holistic manner. Basically, again, that concept of enterprise risk management comes into play so that we have social risk management being understood and addressed at the strategic level of chief executives, for example, trickling down to the directors and then the risk managers and then the frontline managers. So at the end of the day, each person takes responsibility for risk. So we found out that, I found out that social risk cannot be managed in silo. That's the first thing. The second recommendation was that there has to be training. There has to be training about social risk, the signification structures that organizations use, for example, the risk registers, the company policies, all of these documents should be explicit about social risk and what it means. So training platforms generally, or even within the organization intranet, should talk about social risk. Then everybody becomes more aware of this and how to manage it. So that's the second recommendation as well from that.
Excellent. So it's interesting because, as you know, organizations and executive have a suite, a whole list of risks that could be elevated to the leadership level for prioritization. And there's a lot of competition to getting the attention of, the boards and everything like that in terms of getting resources, prioritization, and tackling those things that need to happen. Keeping that in mind, how do you, other than what you've said, because we see the value, right? How do you convince leadership that, hey, this should be elevated up to a level in that risk profile, competing with cyber privacy, all AI, and all these other types of risks they have to look at? How do you position yourself to actually elevate the value of this, even though you have evidence? You have evidence based on your research. How do you do that?
One word: sustainability. Sustainability is the buzzword right now. And so sustainability comes into play. So with all the initiatives that organizations embark on, if we cannot ensure sustainability of the practices, and if we cannot evidence show the communities, the key stakeholders, who are those who will be using whatever products or services that they're producing, that there'll be no adverse effects or impact on them, then there'll be a problem. So we're talking about social risk as an origin, but then, or a source, is a source of other type of risks, like strategic risks. Reputational risk is a type of is a strategic risk, isn't it? So if organizations refuse to address social risk at infancy, it will come back to bite everyone in the back. Because look at what's happening. For instance, we're talking about corporate social responsibility. If you look at the issue of oil spillage, we had a lot of oil spillage by the big oil companies. The oil spillage, what happens is that it affects communities. It kills aquatic life, doesn't it? And so when you have initiatives or projects by big organizations not being managed properly, then it affects the communities. And at the end of the day, there's a financial risk. It's all good to ignore social risk, but at the end of the day, we will be forced to address it if it's not managed and it escalates into a societal problem. So I think it falls on it's the chief executive. It's always, they are the ones that are always responsible, ultimately responsible for organizational risk, right? So it falls on the chief executives and the board to understand the social impact. So there should be a social impact of what would happen to the a social impact on the community. So corporate social responsibility and sustainability comes into play. And then if they are not looking at what will happen, if they're not concerned about the impact on the communities, they will be concerned about the impact on their balance sheet, the financial risk that will occur because they're going to have to pay out, compensate the communities and the individuals that suffer for that. That's a very that's an example, but there are so many other examples that we can use to drive home the fact that social risk management it should be a strategic issue, and it should come up right there at the top. I think it depends on how we present the information a lot of times. If we give the board too much information, they then struggle to grasp. Just a one-liner will do.
Yeah, we've all been there where there's so much you can share with the board, but one, you don't have a lot of time. Two, their attention span is pretty short. And three, if you have a decision for them to make, you have to give them what the options are and what possible solutions are so that they can make those particular type of decisions. So in terms of relationships, when it comes to matters like this, what's the best way for organizations to establish conversations or socialize the idea around the social risks? What should the chief risk officer be doing in this position?
Well, there are little things that can be done, and there are big things that can be done. The big actions would involve the training, trying to get everybody to understand. But the little things would be like dropping it in everyday discourse, making it part of the diction of the organization or the taxonomy of the organization, including that in corporate documents, in the corporate policy, so that everybody becomes aware of what social risk is. We all know what financial risk is,
Mhm.
so immediately you talk about financial risk, everybody, the antennas are up. So we need to get to a place where that also happens with social risk.
So it doesn't matter the framework, anything that you're using. It's really about picking that up and running with it and being vocal about this particular area of risk, but also having a deeper understanding. I think risk professionals need to have a deeper understanding so that they can articulate this in a different way, strategically, the long tail of this in terms of how it impacts communities financially, the future of those who work within the economy and those who are being left out because we're
Yes.
not taking into account the risk impact that this exclusion from these fundamental initiatives could have. You have to
Yes.
have people involved. There have to be a demographic that's part of this, and we don't want to exclude anybody. And you pretty much demonstrated what that can look like and how that can have an impact on organizations long term in terms of sustainability. So as we wrap up, I want to leave you with the last word. Any last thoughts about your research and any recommendations you would make to other organizations nationally or internationally in terms of the social risk piece?
Well, in terms of the social risk piece, I'll basically reiterate the fact that it's creating an avenue or enabling understanding of that is very important. A lot of people will struggle to understand what social risk is, and that's because we don't talk about it. It's implicit in discussions. We talk about inequalities, we talk about exclusions. It's there in discussions. We want to avoid inequalities as much as possible. We want to create an equal playing field for everybody. But so it's implicit in the discussions. We just need to make it a bit more explicit by referring to this as social risk. Because you see, when it's explicit, then it will be addressed. Financial risk is explicit, it's addressed. Regulatory risk is explicit, it's addressed. Nobody wants to get into any legal issues, and so they always try to prevent or avoid or address or mitigate the effects of any legislative risk. We need to get to that place, that kind of understanding with social risk. So it's not just public sector organizations, it's also the private sector organizations, because some of their initiatives could worsen inequalities, exacerbate inequalities, introduce poor outcomes for their staff and their users, the customers as well. So, and the final one I would like to say is that social risk can be a source of strategic risk, reputational risk, financial risk, legislative risk, organizational risk. So when we do not address social risk at infancy, it can escalate into any or more of those risk categories that I've just mentioned.
Right, and just to stress, you're just looking at social risks in terms of public service reform and within the education, uh, in terms of school education, but it could be in any area,
Oh,
in
oh
any discipline, not just education, just to let people know that. But listen,
yeah.
Eni, I want to thank you for your time and sharing with us information about, understanding more about social risk and how it plays out in the broad context of public service reform and the great work that you're doing in terms of case studies and evidence-based practice to help inform decision making within organizations. So again, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Karen. Thank you for having me.
Again, thank you everyone for joining me today on Flip This Risk Podcast. I'm Dr. Karen Hardy, and I'll see you next time.